Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you be in the world, whatever the time is there. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the original owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is based, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Their elders have sole rights to the land, sea, and air. Also, to acknowledge the same rights for the elders and the peoples of other lands who are participating in this webinar based. This is a great webinar today, the first of a series that have come out of a wonderful, just produced by the Chinese Philosophy and Culture Group, research group of the China Studies Center, by Professor Ying-Jie Guo, who's going to, and contains a number of contributions, three of which are being presented this week, next week, and the week after in a mini-series of webinars, all around the concept of Jiaohua in China. It's a great pleasure then to hand over to Ying-Jie Guo to introduce the first of those three webinars, Professor Tony Welsh. Ying-Jie, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Good evening, everyone, if you are in Australia. Good morning or good afternoon if you are in different time zones. It's a great honor to introduce you to my good colleague at the China Studies Center here, Professor Tony Welsh. Anthony Welsh is a professor of education at the University of Sydney. He's published numerous books and articles on education reforms, particularly in Australia and the Asia-Pacific region. He's been a consultant to state, national and international agencies, governments, institutions, and foundations in education. He directed the ARC project, which I single out because it's highly relevant to Chinese studies, the Chinese knowledge diaspora. His work, not just on this, but in many areas of education, has been translated into a dozen languages. And he has been visiting professor in the USA, UK, Germany, France, Japan, Sweden, Malaysia, Turkey, China, Hong Kong, and other places. So I'm sure you'd agree with me that Professor Welsh is a truly international scholar. His topic today is Everything Old is New Again, Confucianism, Legalism and Jiaohua in Chinese Higher Education. This is a chapter, as David mentioned in the book, Jiaohua, Chinese Ideas and Practices of Moral Transformation, which was published not long ago. Without further ado, over to you, Professor Welsh.
Thank you, Ying-Jie. Thank you for that generous introduction. Salutations for bringing together a rich range of diverse perspectives on this fascinating notion of Jiaohua and its influence in China. As Professor Guo indicated, my perspective on this is looking at the interplay of Confucianism and legalism to do with this notion of Jiaohua, but particularly looking at it with respect to higher education in China. So Jiaohua is certainly an ancient concept. It dates back, according to scholars, to around about the Warring States period. And it's been translated in a number of ways, but central to this is the idea around education and transformation, not just self-cultivation, but with implications also for social governance and order in society. There's a strong ethical component that runs through the concept, including implications for family relations, but also for governing the state and achieving great harmony for all under heaven, that notion of Tian Sha. But it's interesting in that we're not just dealing with an ancient concept, but there has been some reinvocation of that civilizing mission in the current era, most particularly over the last decade or so, and I'll come to that later. So we must also recognize and acknowledge that while one can certainly see Jiaohua in ancient China and ancient Chinese thought, it's often not in pure form because of the syncretic nature of Chinese philosophy. We see at various times elements of Taoism incorporated, or sometimes Confucian ethics and values married to versions of legalism. So it's not that pure versions of each were always present. So in practice, and sometimes in theory, more in practice, the current context can also be argued to be somewhat syncretic, and I'll come to that shortly. It's been argued by some scholars that what we're witnessing now is a kind of curated form of Confucian principles, which is being deployed in the service of the state. We see over the last decade or more a significant reassertion of the leading role of the party, including in higher education, and of ideology. So that growth of orthodoxy, if you like, and the emphasis on it has been characterized by some as representing some regrowth and reassertion of legalist principles. We must also reckon with relations between national and local levels of governance, including, in this case, how educators understand and implement centrally formulated measures. And lastly, it's important too to recognize that traditions of Chinese governance, including in higher education, are somewhat different to those in much of the West, notably in relation to how individual and institutional autonomy and service to the state functions. That certainly includes higher education. So if we briefly sketch some of the mainsprings of Confucianism, we're talking here about form of cultivation, self-cultivation, if you like. Starting from a standpoint for Confucianism, which says humans are essentially good and educable and endowed with key virtues, benevolence, right or righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness or faithfulness. From that point of view then, from that standpoint, poor behaviour, misconduct, is therefore the product of environment, and that obviously includes poor education or improper education. So the core Confucian precepts emphasize virtue, ritual or propriety, moral suasion, and obligation. While all individuals have the capacity to become good, not all of them develop that capacity. So individuals are not equally endowed with this notion of suji or quality. From that, within that framework, moral patterns of behavior stem from heaven and human nature and are achieved by moral, ethical cultivation, self-cultivation, leading to a form of mental transformation. So from that standpoint, laws have no moral validity in themselves. On the contrary, legal sanctions and forms of coercion lead to a culture of submission and evasion, whereas for Confucians, it's virtue It's ritual and a sense of shame that should and will lead individuals along the path of self-rectification and self-cultivation. That applies to individuals and, of course, to leaders also. So, in other words, if a ruler behaves ethically, subjects should obey. And effectively here, the metaphor or model of the paternalistic family operates as a microcosm of a broadly hierarchical society. Within that, the role of education and the role of the scholar assume particular importance. And one can see that historically in terms of its influence and the spread of a broadly Confucian model of education, particularly in East Asia, in Korea, and for a time in Japan, and to some extent, and for quite some time, in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, and it's argued still there are signs of it within, say, Singapore. Within this, the personal and the political are interwoven. So the cultivation, the self-cultivation of the scholar at a personal level, that ethical movement, is paralleled by practices of benevolent governance in the wider world. So within that framework of a moral universe, and importantly, one that emphasizes practical engagement in the world rather than a retreat, moral education, self-cultivation function as key means of social reform and a way to restore and maintain the good society. So for the well-known scholar official, it's not enough to be efficient, it's not enough to have expertise. It is rather insight, rectitude, fairness, and judgment and sense of appropriateness that are really important. Now, that's the theory. Did it work as it should have? Of course not, not always. The system worked imperfectly so that, and I'm using here a quote from some time ago, I think this is from before, it might be very early Qing or it might be Min. Government officials are often selected based on personal relations and are not necessarily capable of doing what they're chosen for. So in practice, it wasn't always perfect. If we turn to legalism now, there's a quite clear contrast. The starting principles, if you like, are very, very different. Here, the assumption is that as humans are at very least self-interested and perhaps even evil, and therefore in need of strict governance. So from that standpoint, law becomes critically important as the basis of good governance, law and its impartiality. From that framework, within that framework, it's necessary to control poor behaviour through laws and sanctions for those that transgress. Personal relations networks, what is often now called guanxi, can lead to perverse or poor outcomes. Equally, the Confucian emphasis on self-cultivation and moral suasion and good example are not always sufficient to bring about good behaviour. As in Han Fei-zi, the legalist scholars, who cites the parable of the recalcitrant boy who exhibits poor behaviour again and again and again, and who is ultimately only reformed by the actions of a magistrate and soldiers who enforce the law. So legalism embodies principles of strong state control and obedience to authority through a suite of laws that specify prescribed punishments and rewards for forms of behaviour. And in that, loyalty to the state transcends loyalty to the family. So institutions need to be carefully constructed within that framework to guard against detrimental behaviour and to ensure good governance. But again, just as we saw with Confucianism, practice did not always follow precept. The famed examination system that was the basis of selection for the scholar official, in practice, tended to favour sons, and I emphasise the gender dimension here, of wealthy, educated families who had enhanced, richer cultural capital. And beyond that, performance incentives, which were part of this framework, could have perverse effects, like when soldiers, for example, who were rewarded according to the number of heads cut off during battle, could increase their rewards by decapitating civilians. So again, practice wasn't always following theory. So this long-standing and complex interweaving of Confucian and legalist principles has certainly left its mark on Chinese society and on traditions of governance, including in higher education. And there have been attempts to incorporate elements of both at times, resulting in more systematic outcomes. The Tang Dynasty's legal code, for example, incorporated li into fa, which entailed listing failure to practice filial piety and righteousness, core Confucian virtues, among the 10 abominations which attracted punishment. So this synthesis of Confucianism and legalism, sometimes called Ru Biao Fa Li, Confucian on the outside, legalist on the inside. And we'll come back to that in the modern version shortly. It could have benefits. Legalism, on one hand, could boost administrative capacity and impartiality, while, on the other hand, Confucian principles meant that rulers should serve the wider good rather than just their own interests. To come to the current era, some have argued that legalism has strengthened significantly over the past decade or more, in part via, appeals rather to widespread and long-standing concerns in Chinese society about the impact of weakness and disunity, an insight and a belief that stems from tumultuous episodes at various times in Chinese history. So if we look at Confucian and legalist legacies in contemporary Chinese higher education, we see that what's sometimes called New Confucianism has been promoted in Chinese official discourse over the last decade or more, and acknowledged by some analysts as a form of soft authoritarianism with a strong emphasis on harmony, on stability, on benevolence, and conflict avoidance. That form has been recognized as a somewhat curated form, one which served the interests of the times and arguably the regime. It may have gained further traction because of the lack of detailed knowledge of the Confucian ethical framework among the wider population, including university students. I'm sure many of you have had the same experience of talking to young Chinese students and finding that they have, in many cases, even at leading universities, a rather incomplete understanding of their own history and schools of thought in Chinese society. Either way, this curated form can be deployed as a way of legitimating governance, including in higher education. And we see, arguably, legalist echoes in increased efforts of the past decade or more to regulate ideas within higher education and the broader system. Examples include Document 9, from 2013 that listed the 7 no's, qi bu jiang, prohibited themes that should be avoided in universities, like constitutionalism, universal values, civil society and rights, cronyism and mistakes of the CCP, neoliberalism, press freedom, judicial independence. Another example was later 16 guidelines on strengthening and improving the ideological and political work of young teachers in colleges and universities, which laid great stress on ideological study for junior teachers, those who were going through the appointments or promotions process, and actually incorporated a separate step in both appointments and promotions processes, which emphasized and ensured that compliance in terms of ideology was part of the both appointments and promotions process. We also see the release some years ago of an app, Shuixi Changguo, which monitors ideological commitment, and that was released in 2019. So this is an app which operates on one's phone for party members, government employees, including, of course, faculty, who were encouraged to download the app, which then displays each person's activity on publicly available leaderboards. All forms of study, relevant study, are recorded and quantified and rewarded by the system, which is quite detailed. It has daily login bonuses, it has subscriptions, it has the ability to redeem points for virtual gifts. Colleagues, however, when you speak with them, report that such activities are increasingly time-consuming and burdensome, and in fact detract from the time and energy available for teaching and research. But it's important. Individuals need to maintain a certain level of daily credits. But because, as I indicated, compliance can be time-consuming, so sometimes the actual work was outsourced to relatives or subordinates, as you can see here in the following quote. I had to do all the tests for several seniors of my family, made for a pretty fun spring festival. Other users search online for guides on how to earn more points. Some also played the required videos, but on mute. And because reports are a significant part of the app and need to be submitted regularly, a kind of cottage industry has sprung up where you can download and submit required reports that you've downloaded from online. This is the app here, as you can see. So what are the implications of all of this? Where does this leave Jiaohua? Well, we need to acknowledge, firstly, that this is a substantial system that we're dealing with. The higher education system is by far the largest worldwide, with something like 45 million students now enrolled and graduating something like 11 million a year. But at the cost of widening inequality, to which to some extent it contributes, rising graduate unemployment and underemployment, credentialism, wasted skills, and squandered aspirations. So some have argued, including Zhou Chang, that while expanded enrollments may originally have been motivated by Confucian values on the importance of education, the stratification of universities capitalized on the legalist notion of optimizing the state interest. And I think anyone who looks at the Chinese higher education system would acknowledge it is probably the most clearly stratified of any higher education system anywhere. So we can argue that the current stress on the leading role of the party and of ideology is more demonstrative of legalist norms of statecraft and control. But the contemporary higher education system can be seen as a kind of synthesis of legalism and Confucianism. Confucianism in semblance, legalism in essence. Many individuals, many colleagues remain committed to traditional academic values, but the control and politicization of higher education, especially over the last decade or so, mean institutional logics tend towards instrumentalism. So we have not only a strong history of Jiaohua incorporating elements of legalism and Confucianism, but in the current era also to some extent a blend, perhaps tilting more towards legalism over the past decade or so. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tony.